The story of Russia, at least from a written history perspective, first begins in 862 AD. Before this time, very little is known. What is known is that before the 9th century, there was a mass migration of various Slavic tribes into parts of Eastern Europe. Slavs would form the core population of a number of medieval Christian kingdoms. The Eastern Slavs under the Rus princes, the Bulgarian Empire, Croatia, Serbia, Poland, Bohemia, and many more. So in that year, a Varangian chieftain of the Rus named Rurik took control of Ladoga and built a settlement near Novgorod. Eventually, he moved to Novgorod itself and assumed the title of Prince of Novgorod. Now, there are 4 main titles that we are concerned with: the Prince of Novgorod, the Grand Prince of Kiev, the Grand Prince of Vladimir, and the Grand Prince of Moscow. Early on, the 2 most significant titles were that of Novgorod and Kiev. Vladimir and Moscow emerged centuries later. It's also important to note that at different time periods, a city might have dominion over the entire realm. And so I've divided these up chronologically in terms of when a particular city reached the zenith of its power. In addition, some princes retained all of the titles, and at other times a prince might only have one of these titles, especially when the kingdoms became fragmented. I think the situation compares very favorably to the Holy Roman Empire. At times, the Germanic kingdoms were united under one banner, and at other times they were deeply fragmented. Okay, so back to Rurik. He is believed to have been part of the tribe that originated from modern-day Sweden. The name of the tribe was the Varangians. The tribe, along with other Scandinavian entities, began to raid and set up trade routes that stretched from the Baltic Sea all the way to the Black Sea. Collectively, they are referred to as the Rus, and also the Viking Rus. Over time, the Rus would assimilate with the local Slavic population and lost much of their original culture. And so Rurik became the founder of the Rurik dynasty. The dynasty ruled over 700 years, and amazingly would last all the way up to the time of the first Tsars. Therefore, the Rus were the first people to exert control over the region. What does this mean? Well, at a basic level, it meant tributes or taxes would have been collected from the surrounding regions by a central authority. Before we move on, I should mention that there is quite a bit of controversy over whether the Rus were originally Vikings or Slavs. Many historians believe the Rus were in fact Vikings, while some Russian and Ukrainian nationalist historians generally argue that the Rus were originally Slavs. In the end, it really doesn't matter, since the Rus eventually adopted Slavic languages and customs. Okay, so back to Rurik. He led the Rus until his death in about 879. He installed Prince Oleg as regent for his young son, Igor. Between 880 and 882, Oleg led a military force south along the Dnieper River, capturing Smolensk before reaching Kiev, where he deposed the ruler and proclaimed himself prince. He also declared Kiev the mother of all Rus cities. Oleg set about consolidating his power over the surrounding region, imposing tribute on the Eastern Slavic tribes. Kiev prospered because it controlled several of the main trade routes in Eastern Europe. Also, the rapid expansion of the Rus to the south led to conflict with the Khazars. Increasingly, the Rus and Khazars fought to secure control over the lucrative trade routes. One of the greatest rulers during the time of the Kievan Rus was Vladimir the Great. After the death of his father in 972, Vladimir, who was then Prince of Novgorod, was forced to flee to Scandinavia. He assembled an army and returned to depose his brother in 980. Vladimir continued to expand territories beyond his father's extensive domain. In 981, he seized towns from the Poles. He also conducted a successful military campaign against the Volga Bulgars. In 987, Vladimir dispatched envoys to study the major religions. Previously, the Rus had primarily adhered to pagan customs. In the end, Vladimir settled on Eastern Orthodox Christianity. He even traveled to Constantinople and arranged to marry Princess Anna, who was the sister of the Byzantine emperor. After Vladimir died in 1015, a power struggle ensued between his sons. Yaroslav the Wise emerged as the victor and became the Grand Prince of Kiev in 1019. Like Vladimir, Yaroslav was eager to improve relations with the rest of Europe, especially the Byzantine Empire. The gradual disintegration of the Kievan Rus began in the 11th century, after the death of Yaroslav. The position of Grand Prince of Kiev was also weakened by the growing influence of regional clans. It also didn't help that power was sometimes transferred to the eldest member of the ruling dynasty, rather than from father to son. This led to several conflicts and rivalries within the royal family. So once again, these factors led to a reduction in the influence and power of Kiev. The decline of Kiev saw the rise of the Principality of Vladimir. Andrew the Pious increased Vladimir's power at the expense of the nearby princely states. In 1169, his troops sacked and plundered Kiev. While Andrew treated many other cities with contempt, he increased the power and beauty of his capital, Vladimir. He constructed many new churches and buildings. Prince Andrew was murdered by the boyars in 1174. By the way, boyars were members of the old feudal aristocracy in Russia, basically one rank below a prince. So after a brief period, Andrew's brother Vsevolod III secured the throne. He promptly subjugated the boyars and systematically raided the Volga peoples, most notably Volga, Bulgaria. Similar to his brother, he subjugated Kiev in 1203. After Vsevolod died, his son Yuri took over. It was during Yuri's reign in Vladimir that the Mongols first approached Russia in 1223. In response, he sent a small force to assist the other Rus princes, but they arrived too late to take part in the disastrous battle of the Kalka River. The battle was a significant defeat, especially since many of the Rus principalities lost most of their armies, with the notable exception of Vladimir. When the Mongols returned in 1237, Yuri once again did not provide much help to the other Rus princes, but soon his own capital came under direct threat. Yuri's forces were soon easily routed by the Mongol hordes. After his capital, Vladimir, was sacked, Yuri fled across the Volga northward, where he hastily mustered another army. He and his brothers then turned back toward Vladimir in hopes of relieving the city before the Mongols took it. But they were too late. Yuri's army was surrounded and annihilated once again. The battle marked the end of a unified resistance against the Mongols, and ushered in 2 centuries of Mongol domination over Russia and the Ukraine. Alexander Nevsky became one of the leading figures of the Rus after Yuri's death in 1238. Nevsky faced major threats during his reign. In the west, the lands of the Rus faced fresh invasions from the Germans and Swedes. Nevsky halted the Crusaders' expansion at the Battle of Ice. The battle is notable for having been fought largely on a frozen lake, which gave the battle its name. The battle was a significant defeat sustained by the Crusaders during the Northern Crusades, which were directed against pagans and Eastern Orthodox Christians rather than Muslims in the Holy Land. The results of the battle also halted the eastward expansion of the Teutonic Order. In the east, Nevsky was forced to collaborate with the Mongols, who were imposing their rule on Russia. Nevsky's cautious policy was more about preserving the Rus, since an all-out war against the Mongols would likely have resulted in the complete destruction of his kingdom. The alliance also worked in Alexander's favor, as he was able to consolidate his authority over the Rus and boyars. The Khan even installed Alexander as the Grand Prince of Vladimir in 1252. Alexander Nevsky's youngest son Daniel came of age in the 1270s. He aided his brother Dmitry in his bid for the rule of Novgorod. Daniel, however, centered his power base in Moscow. Before Daniel, Moscow had been a minor principality, but during his lifetime, Daniel greatly increased the reputation of the city. Daniel ruled Moscow as Grand Duke until 1303, and established it as a prosperous city that would eclipse its parent principality of Vladimir by the 1320s. Daniel's son Ivan I took over after his father's death. Several factors aided Moscow in its rise to prominence. One of the most important was geography. Moscow was situated in the middle of the other Russian principalities. Thus, it was largely protected from any invasions from the east and the west. Another factor was the decision of the Khan to make the Grand Prince of Moscow responsible for collecting all the tributes from Russian cities. This paved the way for Moscow's future role as a regional power. Things really began to take off after Dmitry Ivanovich assumed the throne in 1359. Dmitry was the grandson of Ivan I. Dmitry boosted the defenses of the Kremlin, replacing the wooden walls with stone. The work was completed in 1367. Thanks to the new fortress, the city withstood 2 sieges by the Lithuanians during his reign. Mongol domination of the Rus began to crumble during Dmitry's 30-year reign. The Golden Horde was severely weakened by civil war and dynastic rivalries. Dmitry took advantage of the decline in Mongol strength and decided to openly challenge them. The Mongols attempted to reduce Dmitry's growing power, but were defeated by Russian forces in the Battle of the Volga River in 1378. This was significant in that the Russians were able to defeat a large Mongol army. 2 years later, the Mongols dispatched another large force against Moscow. The battle was opened by single combat between 2 champions. However, the Russian and Mongol champion killed each other in the first run. Dmitry then led his army out and defeated the Golden Horde. The Mongols returned yet again in 1382, and this time finally succeeded in taking Moscow. Despite all of the turmoil, the Mongols reinstated Dmitry as the principal tax collector and Grand Duke of Vladimir, and with that Dmitry pledged his loyalty to the Mongols. Still, the situation was gradually favoring the Russians. Dmitry died in 1389, leaving all of his titles to his son. He didn't even bother consulting with the Mongols about his succession plans. Ivan III was the great-grandson of Dmitry. Ivan's rule is marked by what some historians called the gathering of the Russian lands. Ivan brought many of the Rus princes under the direct control of Moscow. Ivan III's main adversary during this time was the Republic of Novgorod. Novgorod was alarmed at the growing power of Moscow. They decided to seek an alliance with Poland and Lithuania. Ivan took the field against Novgorod in 1470, and after his generals had twice defeated the forces of Novgorod, the city was forced to sue for peace. Ivan also rejected the authority of the Khans by refusing to pay the customary tribute. The Khans organized a military campaign, but eventually retreated in 1480. For all intents and purposes, this was the end of Khan rule in Russia. After Ivan died, his son Vasily III assumed the throne in 1505. Vasily continued the policies of his father, and spent most of his reign consolidating Ivan's gains. Vasily also annexed some of the last surviving autonomous provinces. Vasily died in 1533. Ivan IV was proclaimed the Grand Prince of Moscow at the request of his father. You might know him better as Ivan the Terrible. Ivan's mother initially acted as regent, but she died in 1538 when Ivan was only 8 years old. The regency then alternated between several feuding boyar families, each vying for control. Ivan was finally proclaimed Tsar in 1547 at the age of 17, establishing the Tsardom of Russia, with Moscow as the predominant state. Ivan's reign was characterized by Russia's transformation from a medieval state into an empire. During his reign, Ivan achieved almost absolute power by executing or forcibly exiling many members of prominent boyar clans. Ivan also sought to finally reduce the influence of Novgorod. In 1570, Ivan ordered his forces to raid the city. Novgorod was brutally pillaged and burned. The city would never regain its former prominence. Ivan also sought to expand the frontiers of the Russian Empire. He started a large-scale exploration and colonization of Siberia. Ivan's death ushered in the Time of Troubles, which is one of the most bizarre and turbulent times in Russian history. Ivan's oldest son, Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, had been groomed as the heir apparent since a young age. However, Tsarevich Ivan was accidentally killed by his father during an argument. This made Fyodor I the heir apparent, and he became Tsar of Russia after his father died in 1584. The problem was that Fyodor had little interest in politics, and the country was effectively run by Boris Godunov. Problems really began to emerge after Fyodor died in 1598. He had no children, and so this caused serious instability within the Russian Empire. Godunov simply seized the throne for himself, likely out of fear of what might have happened to him if he was not the ruler. Godunov's reign was not as successful as his administration under the Tsar, mainly because many saw him as a pretender to the throne. The Russian nobility, headed by the Romanovs, considered it a disgrace to obey a boyar. Godunov's reign became even more unstable when in 1600 Dmitry I made a stunning appearance. He claimed to be the last son and legitimate heir of Ivan the Terrible. This seemed very strange since the real Dmitry had died a decade earlier in 1591. This mysterious Dmitry I actually attracted support in Russia by those who despised Godunov. He also garnered support from Poland and the papacy. Poland saw him as a tool to extend their influence in Russia, while the Pope saw it as an opportunity to increase the influence of Roman Catholicism. Immediately after Godunov's death in 1605, False Dmitry I, as he was referred to, made his triumphal entry into Moscow and amazingly was crowned Tsar. Dmitry's reign lasted only 11 months, when in May of 1606, a massive number of boyars and commoners stormed the Kremlin. Tsar Dmitry attempted to flee, jumping out of a window, but broke his leg in the fall. He was captured and executed by the boyars. Quite amazingly, this was not the end of the false Dmitries. Another false Dmitry appeared in 1607, and yet again in 1612. The Time of Troubles finally came to an end with the coronation of Michael Romanov in 1613. This established the Romanov dynasty. The first task of Michael was to clear the land of the countries occupying it. Sweden and Poland were then dealt with respectively by a peace treaty. Michael's reign saw the greatest territorial expansion in Russian history. During his reign, the conquest of Siberia continued, and Russian territory reached the Pacific Ocean. The greatest Tsar in Russian history was Peter the Great. Through a number of successful wars, Peter expanded the empire, and Russia became a major European power. He also greatly increased the size and power of the Russian Navy. This allowed the Russians to capture several strategic ports on the Baltic Sea. Peter sought to modernize Russia, and so he led a cultural revolution that replaced many of the medieval social and political systems with ones that were more in tune with the Enlightenment. In addition, he founded the city of St. Petersburg, which remained the capital of Russia until 1917. Peter died in 1725 without naming a successor. His wife Catherine had the support of the Guard regiments, and with their assistance she was proclaimed the ruler of Russia, giving her the title of Empress. Catherine was the first woman to rule Imperial Russia, setting a legal precedent for a century almost entirely dominated by women, including her daughter Elizabeth and her granddaughter-in-law Catherine the Great, all of whom continued Peter the Great's policies in modernizing Russia. For most of her reign, Catherine was tightly controlled by her advisors. However, the immense size of the Russian army was taking a toll on the state's finances. Catherine, against the wish of her advisors, reduced military expenditures, which resulted in tax relief for the peasantry. This contributed to her reputation as a fair and excellent ruler. Catherine's daughter Elizabeth was the Empress of Russia from 1741 until her death in 1762. She led the country in opposition to Prussia during the 7 Years' War, which occurred between 1756 and 1763. She was also known to spend large sums of money, especially after she built the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. This would become the residence of all future Russian monarchs. Catherine II was Empress of Russia from 1762 until 1796, the country's longest ruling female leader. She came to power following a coup that she organized, resulting in her husband Peter III being overthrown. Under her reign, Russia was revitalized. It grew larger and stronger, and was recognized as one of the great powers of Europe. Under her rule in 1771, the Russian fleet totally annihilated the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Chesma. Russia also started to colonize Alaska, establishing Russian America. Similar to her predecessors, she enthusiastically supported the ideals of the Enlightenment and was a patron of the arts. The period during Catherine's rule is considered the Golden Age of Russia. During the early 19th century, Russia became embroiled in the chaotic Napoleonic Wars. Emperor Alexander I, however, was finally able to achieve a major victory over Napoleon after the failed attack on Russia in 1812. Despite the victory, Russia was really never the same, and this paved the way for future rebellions. Early on in his career, Alexander instituted several liberal reforms in response to the changing political climate in Russia and Europe. But later in his reign, he became suspicious of plots against him, and therefore ended many of the reforms he made earlier. He became more politically conservative, and this was reflected in the advisors he appointed. Nicholas I became Emperor of Russia in 1825, after Alexander's death. Like his father before him, Nicholas was a conservative. In 1848, revolutions broke out against the monarchies throughout Europe. Alarmed that the revolution might spread to Russia, the emperor helped crush some of the rebellion. Nicholas also oversaw Russia's disastrous defeat in the Crimean War that occurred between 1853 and 1856. Alexander II assumed the throne after his father Nicholas died in 1855. Alexander immediately saw the need to reform Russia. His most significant policy as emperor was the emancipation of Russia's serfs in 1861, for which he is known as Alexander the Liberator. The emperor was responsible for many other reforms, including ending some of the privileges of the nobility and promoting university education. Alexander also sold Alaska to the United States in 1867, fearing the remote colony would fall into foreign hands if there was another war. During his reign, the emperor largely pursued a pacifist policy and attempted to maintain peace with Germany and Austria. Alexander II was assassinated in 1881 by revolutionaries. Ironically, his death was a great setback for the reform movement. After his father's death, Alexander III became the Emperor of Russia. Domestically, he reversed many of the liberal reforms of his father. He further opposed any reform that limited his autocratic rule. Determined not to suffer the fate of his father, the emperor used his secret police to arrest protesters and disband rebel groups. In terms of foreign affairs, Russia fought no major wars during Alexander III's reign, and he has therefore been referred to as the peacemaker. Nicholas II continued many of the conservative policies of his father as Emperor of Russia. However, what he did not pursue was the pacifist policy of the previous ruler. In 1914, he supported Serbia and approved the mobilization of the Russian army. In response, Germany declared war on Russia and its ally France on August 1, 1914, starting the First World War. The Russian army suffered several defeats, which led to a collapse of morale at the front and at home, leading to the collapse of the emperor's rule in the February Revolution of 1917. Nicholas abdicated, and along with his family, he was imprisoned by the Bolsheviks and executed in July of 1918. The time of the monarchy and Russian Empire had come to an end.